Every Thursday at this time, we get to visit with our friends over at the Texan.News, and McKenzie Taylor, the senior editor at the Texan, joining us this afternoon. McKenzie, good afternoon. How are you?
I'm well, Chad. Thanks for having me back on.
Absolutely. It's a big day down in Austin as we have committee assignments that have been released. Talk to our audience about the assignments that were released today, and a lot of people, kind of surprised at the shakeup in some of the leadership roles.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, twist my arm to get to talk about this. So this is something we look very forward to in the political world here in Austin. Certainly. So we ushered in a new Texas House Speaker this session in Representative Dade Phelan of Beaumont. Certainly expected some shifts to happen in terms of the chairmanships of these committees, but I think this exceeded some of the expectations that were set. Appropriations has a new chair, calendars, pub ed, state affairs, redistricting, all sorts of new chairmen and very, very powerful and influential committees. I think it is of particular note for your audience that the calendars committee, which is essentially the committee that once bills are passed through their respective committee calendars, decides if they make it to the floor and are heard before the full House. Representative Dustin Burrows from Lubbock will be the chair of that committee. Very powerful position. Really just denotes a lot of trust that Speaker Phelan has in Representative Burrows going forward. He'll replace Flor Price, who was that chairman under Speaker Bonin. Very interesting to see that come down the pipe. We have State Affairs, Chris Patty, who will take over Representative Phelan, for Representative Phelan in that capacity, in a very powerful committee as well. I think one committee that did not get as much coverage that a lot of right-of-center Texans really do care about is the Homeland Security and Public Safety Committee. This is historically the committee that a lot of Second Amendment bills go to. And previously, this committee was chaired by Representative Pancho Narvaez, a Democrat from South Texas, who there was a big scandal, involving an envelope of cocaine, some pretty spicy stuff there. But all that to say, Representative Narvaez is no longer in the legislature. Now Representative Chairman James White, who is a Republican, will be chairing that committee. And Representative White previously has, in some capacity, filed and carried a lot of Second Amendment legislation that even a version of constitutional carry. So there is certainly hope for those kinds of bills to make it through the legislature. We've definitely seen constitutional carry be something that a lot of folks care about and have not really had the opportunity to pass through committees like this, which is very interesting. I think redistricting will be a really big deal. We saw Phil King chair that committee in the interim, and now we have Representative Todd Hunter chairing that committee for this session, which will be interesting. He was a former Strauss lieutenant and chaired Calendars Committee back in the day. Charlie Guerin of Fort Worth, longtime House Administration Chairman, is now moved to local and consent calendars. And now we have Will Metcalf, a kind of a new face in the chairmanship world, chairing a pretty powerful committee that oversees more of the operational side of the House. So all sorts of very, very interesting new assignments. And I'd say from a 30,000-foot view perspective, there's just a lot of new blood and powerful positions.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that.
Yeah, we have 21 Republicans, 14 Democrats in chairmanships. As you know, that is a huge point of contention, is whether or not members of both parties should be able to chair committees when one party is in power. And we have 21 Republican chairs, 14 Democrats. With Speaker Bonin, we had 12 Democrat chairs, so it's just a slight increase. I don't think that's as much the story here as the new blood on these different committees is, but it is certainly an interesting fact nonetheless.
When you look at, for one, education, with Harold Dutton becoming the chair of that committee, I've seen, on social media, there's been a lot of congratulations to him on that. But I think that's one that, did have some people saying, well, why not a Republican in that position? I mean, and you could probably say that about some of these other committees. But you're right. It's going to be interesting to see how some of the grassroots organizations out there respond. And I got to be honest with you, McKenzie, I'm kind of interested in seeing how the Texas GOP chairman responds, because he's not someone who stays quiet on some of these issues right now.
Yeah, absolutely. Chairman West is certainly not one to pull punches. And, I think it is interesting in light of what you just said. Representative Dutton, Chairman Dutton, he formerly chaired the Juvenile Justice and Family Issues Committee, had for several sessions, and now has moved to public education, which is by far one of the more powerful committees in a lot of ways. So to see his, switch is very interesting there. And I think, just like you said, grassroots Texans are kind of figuring out how they feel about these changes. I think they'll be happy with an appointment like Homeland Security and Public Safety with Chairman James White, and I think they'll be disappointed in an appointment like Representative Chairman Dutton on public education. So there will be a lot of commentary coming out in these next few days. I don't expect Chairman West will remain silent on a lot of these. He pushed very hard for Republicans to hold these chairmanships and then not to allow Democrat members to hold those positions of leadership. So we'll see what happens in the next day or two. But I mean, that was even a fight on the House rules, right? A lot of members had a very intense concern about whether or not Democrats should be able to chair committees. That was one of the first points of contention this legislative session, and I don't expect that to go away anytime soon.
I thought we're visiting with McKenzie Taylor with the Texan here on the Chad Hasty Show. Something else that I thought was interesting is there are two Freedom Caucus members who are chair of committees in this session with Briscoe Cain and Matt Krause, and that's something that maybe beforehand the Texas Freedom Caucus, they had not built up that that power maybe, and now you see a little bit more acceptance, would you say, of the Texas Freedom Caucus by this new speaker?
Certainly, and I would say that one of the big shifts we've seen in the conservative sect of the Texas House has been Freedom Caucus tactics. Particularly in the last legislative session. I mean, Freedom Caucus members were at large very supportive of Speaker Phelan's ascension to the speakership. Even from behind the scenes, they had been very supportive, and I think that support was, rewarded with some of these different moves. Like you said, Representative Briscoe Cain chairing elections. This is somebody who had traveled to Pennsylvania to be part of Trump's legal team in terms of finding out if there had been fraud in Pennsylvania. This is somebody who was at the forefront of a lot of that, who used to be very well known for throwing bombs in the House and has certainly come to, form a lot of relationships with people. And his chairmanship is certainly something that a lot of folks, particularly on Twitter, found very, very interesting and of note. Representative Matt Krause, he served on the committee, on the General Investigating Committee last legislative session. He was on the committee during the Bonin scandal, served throughout the course of that entire debacle, and now chairs the committee, replacing Representative Morgan Meyer. So, yeah, I think there's certainly seeing some shifts there in tactics and approach from the Freedom Caucus, and I do believe they were, rewarded with positions of power for that.
Yeah, we'll see how all this plays out. That is for sure. It's going to be interesting down in Austin. Let's talk about something else before we let you go, and that is the governor. Obviously, he had a State of the State address. There's been a lot of folks who have spoken out since then, and really have embraced a lot of what the governor had to say as far as the emergency actions that he had brought up. You had a story, I think it was yesterday, Brad Johnson with the Texan wrote up a story about the governor being open to emergency powers and reform of emergency powers. He's open to it. What do you think is gonna happen there, and what are you guys hearing as far as some of these reforms that may be on the table?
Yeah, absolutely. This is a big story here in Austin and throughout the state. I know there is certainly bipartisan criticism of the governor's response to some of the coronavirus restrictions that he has enacted throughout the course of the pandemic. And that goes all the way back to the Texas Disaster Act of 1975. There's a lot of power given to the state executive in terms of that piece of, that law. And we've seen the governor exercise authority in that regard given to him when he issued that disaster declaration. And there has certainly been criticism of that. So I think there's appetite on both sides of the aisle to curtail those kinds of authorities that the governor has taken advantage of in the last year. And it was very interesting to say to see the governor come out and say that he was open to curtailing some of that authority that he's been given. I mean, either way, even if legislation that, even if he didn't come out and say he was for this, he, at the end of the day, would have to sign this legislation into law if it passes both chambers. So this is something that a lot of folks were watching. It was one of the top items that folks expected the legislature to talk about and address this session. Now, I do know, the governor says that as long as the legislation doesn't affect, quote, flexibility to move swiftly, essentially respond to a disaster in a way that would not, cuff him to an extent that he finds detrimental, he would be open to it. So that could mean a lot of things. I think that leaves some vagueness on the table in terms of what can be proposed. But I know the governor will be working behind the scenes with these kinds of issues to find something that both the legislature and the governor can work together on. So we'll see what the result of that is and the teeth, how much teeth there are actually in those kinds of proposals. But I think there's appetite, and I don't expect legislators to let these comments go by the wayside.
Yeah, absolutely. McKenzie Taylor, senior editor at The Texan. You can go to Texan.News to find out more about what's happening in our state. McKenzie, anything big you guys are working on for the next day or two?
All sorts of stuff. I think on our website right now, you'll find a lot of pieces about different legislative proposals that, lawmakers have come forward with. There's a lull in Austin right now. Members won't be back and making moves until, a little bit later on, about a week from now. So all sorts of different pieces on our site detailing what they're proposing here in Austin to keep our readers informed. Definitely worth checking out.
All right. Very good. McKenzie Taylor, we'll visit with you again next week, and have a great week and weekend.
Thank you, sir. Have a good one.
You too. That's McKenzie Taylor, senior editor at The Texan.